The diplomatic shuttle descended through the dense layers of the Zrithian homeworld's atmosphere, its polished surface reflecting the eerie glow of the twin moons. Elias Wren sat motionless in his seat, his hands loosely clasped together. To any observer, he appeared calm, a model diplomat radiating patience and authority. But inside, his mind was a machine calculating, assessing, readying itself for every possible outcome. The air inside the shuttle was heavy with the scent of sterilized metal and faint ozone from the shielding systems. The pilot, a young lieutenant from Earth's diplomatic corps, cleared his throat and spoke in a tone that barely masked his apprehension. "We're on final approach, sir. The Zrithian honor guard will be waiting outside the landing bay." Elias offered a slight nod, his gaze fixed on the view beyond the shuttle's reinforced glass. The Imperial Palace loomed ahead, an imposing monolith of black stone and gold-plated towers, its structure as much a weapon as it was a symbol of power. The Zrithians were known for their brutal efficiency, their conquests stretching across star systems. And yet, despite their technological and military superiority, they had agreed to this negotiation. It was a calculated risk on both sides. The landing struts groaned as they met the polished obsidian platform. A procession of armored figures stood in perfect formation beyond the docking bridge, their scaled, insectoid armor reflecting the ambient light of the burning gas giants overhead. The Zrithians were taller than humans, their elongated limbs and powerful, digitigrade legs making them appear more like predatory beasts than diplomats. But Elias knew better than to let their appearance dictate his perceptions. He had dealt with creatures far more monstrous than the Zrithians. As the shuttle's hatch hissed open, he stepped forward with measured confidence. The air was cooler than expected, carrying the faint trace of something metallic, blood, perhaps, or something worse. His escort remained behind, as per protocol. This meeting was meant to symbolize trust, or at least the illusion of it. At the head of the Zrithian honor guard stood Supreme Chancellor Zalrath, draped in ceremonial robes of deep crimson, his crown-like crest gleaming under the artificial lighting. His eyes, slitted and golden, studied Elias with a predator's patience. "Human," Zalrath intoned, his voice deep and layered, as if two voices spoke at once. "Your presence here is acknowledged." Elias inclined his head just enough to be respectful, but not submissive. "Chancellor, the Earth Federation appreciates the opportunity for this dialogue." Zalrath's mouth curled slightly, the closest thing his species had to a smile. "Calm. We should not waste time on pleasantries." Elias followed as the honor guard flanked him on all sides, their movements synchronized, disciplined. He had studied their tactics extensively. Zrithians fought in coordinated packs, their battlefield strategies reliant on overwhelming precision. It made them formidable in open war, but predictable in one-on-one combat. A useful piece of knowledge, should things go awry. The interior of the palace was a seamless blend of organic and synthetic architecture, walls pulsating faintly as if alive, conduits of luminescent energy threading through their veins. It was both mesmerizing and unsettling. As they walked through vast corridors, Elias noted the positioning of the guards, the hidden turrets embedded in the ceiling, the minute shifts in airflow that suggested security drones tracking his every movement. The palace was a fortress, and he was its guest, or its prisoner. They entered the throne chamber, a vast circular hall lined with towering effigies of past emperors, their names carved in the ancient Zrithian script. At the center of the room, beneath the flickering glow of suspended plasma lanterns, was a throne of polished obsidian, veins of molten gold running through its surface like trapped lightning. Zalrath ascended the steps and turned with deliberate slowness, his golden eyes locking onto Elias. "You humans are fascinating," he mused. "So fragile, yet so persistent. Your species is young, arrogant even. And yet you stand before me, believing you have the right to negotiate." Elias met his gaze without hesitation. "I believe both our species have much to gain from cooperation. A murmur rippled through the gathered Zrithian dignitaries. Some looked amused, others offended. Zalrath merely tilted his head. "Tell me, human, why should we not simply take what we desire? Your colonies are weak. Your fleets, while growing, are still outmatched. What incentive do we have to listen?" Elias allowed himself a small smile. "Because war with humanity would be costly. You may take our colonies, but you won't hold them. Our kind doesn't break, Chancellor. We adapt. We resist. And eventually we win." Zalrath studied him for a long moment, then let out a deep, guttural chuckle. "Ah, the human spirit. Defiant to the end." There was a flicker in his expression, something too rehearsed, too measured. Elias' instinct sharpened, the tension in the room shifting subtly. The faintest whine of displaced air was the only warning. Elias moved before thought, his body reacting faster than conscious processing. A sniper shot, nearly silent, seared past his temple, grazing the outer edge of his shoulder. He dropped, twisting mid-motion, using the momentum to roll behind one of the obsidian pillars. Shouts erupted. The honor guard moved instantly, forming a protective circle around the Emperor, not him. The Zrithians had planned this. They had never intended to negotiate. They had brought him here to die. The realization did not shock him. It merely disappointed him. Elias exhaled slowly, the heat of the near miss still burning against his skin. The Zrithians thought they were hunting him. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. A guard lunged toward him, plasma blade igniting in a sweep meant to bisect him at the waist. Elias moved faster. His right hand caught the alien's wrist, his left elbow slamming into its throat. A swift, surgical twist dislocated the arm before he drove a reinforced knee into the creature's ribcage. The Zrithian crumpled, gurgling, the blade clattering from its grasp. Elias snatched the weapon mid-fall, twisting it in his grip as he pivoted. The next assailant barely had time to react before Elias drove the blade through the gap in its armor. A clean, precise strike between the plates. Panic surged through the chamber. The guards were disciplined, yes, but they had never expected a human diplomat to fight like this. The image of Elias, the soft-spoken envoy, the man of peace, shattered before their eyes. Zalrath rose from his throne, his gaze dark with something between curiosity and unease. "You are no mere diplomat," he murmured. Elias wiped the blood from his blade, his posture relaxed, almost indifferent. "No," he admitted. "I'm not." A flicker of movement caught his attention. Another sniper, repositioning along the upper balcony. Sloppy. Predictable. Elias reached down, retrieving the plasma sidearm from the fallen guard, and fired a single, precise shot. The sniper crumpled, his rifle clattering uselessly to the floor. Zalrath's expression shifted, amusement giving way to something colder. "Who are you?" Elias tilted his head, considering the question. Then, with the slightest smirk, he responded, "A very bad mistake." And with that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the bodies of those foolish enough to cross him. The palace alarms screamed through the corridors, a cascading wail of urgency and confusion. Elias Wren moved through the shadows like a phantom, his breath steady, his pulse an unshaken metronome. The Zrithians had underestimated him. That was their first mistake. Their second was assuming he was just a diplomat. Now, their fortress of arrogance had become his hunting ground. The walls of the palace pulsed with artificial veins of bioluminescence, casting eerie shadows that twisted as he moved. The architecture, though alien, was familiar in its intent, designed to intimidate, to make intruders feel small beneath its towering ceilings and sweeping corridors. But Elias was not intimidated. He was assessing, mapping exits, noting weaknesses. Behind him, the throne room was a scene of chaos. Guards barked orders. Bodies lay still on the polished obsidian floor, and Zalrath stood rigid, his golden eyes narrowed in thought. The Emperor had not expected this turn of events, but he was no fool. He would adapt. Elias had no intention of giving him that chance. A squad of guards rushed through an archway ahead, weapons raised. They were disciplined, quick, but not quick enough. Elias ducked low, the plasma blade still humming in his grip. With a fluid motion, he surged forward, slicing through armor, severing the tendons of the first soldier's leg before pivoting and driving the hilt of his weapon into the second's throat. The third managed a wild shot, too close. Elias twisted, the heat of the plasma bolt searing past his ribs, but he ignored the pain. The moment of imbalance cost the soldier his life. Elias wrenched a blade from his fallen opponent and sent it spinning through the air, embedding it in the Zrithian skull. The last guard staggered back, taloned hands shaking. Fear. Good. It meant hesitation. Elias closed the distance before the alien could even consider retreat. A sharp, efficient strike, 2 inches to the left of the throat, where Zrithian physiology was most vulnerable. The guard collapsed without a sound. The bodies had barely hit the ground before Elias was moving again, slipping through a maintenance access tunnel before the next wave of soldiers arrived. His movements were precise, practiced. This was not improvisation. This was a man returning to his natural state. The corridor narrowed, the light dimming as he approached the security hub. It was a risk, but he needed information. He tapped into his wrist implant, rerouting his biometric signature to blend with the palace's system for 30 seconds. It was a trick he had used countless times before, and the Zrithians, despite their advanced technology, had not anticipated a human capable of such infiltration. The door to the security chamber hissed open, and he slipped inside. Banks of holographic screens displayed the palace's schematics, patrol routes, and, most importantly, the real-time location of the Emperor. Zalrath had retreated deeper into the war chambers, surrounded by his elite guard. Elias allowed himself a small smirk. He accessed the palace's security feeds, cycling through thermal and biometric scans. Reinforcements were arriving from the outer districts, closing in fast. He had maybe 10 minutes before the palace was locked down completely. That was more than enough. A flicker on the screen caught his attention. A secondary life signature within the Emperor's chamber. Not a guard. Something smaller. A different heat signature. An advisor? A strategist? No. A prisoner. Elias narrowed his eyes, zooming in on the encrypted data tags attached to the signature. Earth Federation intelligence markers. A captured human operative. That complicated things. A part of him considered leaving the operative behind. He was here for the Emperor. The mission came first. But another part of him, a part that still clung to some semblance of principle, refused. He shut down the console, leaving behind a silent virus to scramble the data in his wake. No loose ends. The route to the war chamber was heavily fortified, but Elias had no intention of walking through the front door. He moved through the ventilation system, emerging in the lower levels, where maintenance drones hummed in their endless tasks. With practiced efficiency, he disabled the nearest drone, extracting its internal power cell. A makeshift pulse bomb. Crude but effective. He positioned himself near a junction where 2 squads were patrolling. Timing was everything. He counted their steps, their turns, their predictable habits. Then, he activated the device and tossed it into the corridor. A flash of white-hot energy erupted, sending electromagnetic ripples through the walls. The guards' armor flickered, systems shorting. They staggered, disoriented, and that was all Elias needed. He was among them before they could recover, moving with lethal precision. Plasma bolts illuminated the darkness, but he was always one step ahead, weaving through their fire, using their own staggered movements against them. One by one they fell, and when the last body hit the floor, Elias was already moving toward the war chamber. The entrance was sealed, reinforced against orbital bombardment. But no lock was perfect. He bypassed the panel with a bypass sequence, and the doors hissed open just enough for him to slip through. Inside, the room was bathed in a dull red glow. Tactical holomaps flickered over a circular war table, displaying fleet movements and territorial holdings. And at the far end, Zalrath stood, watching him with unreadable intent. "You are full of surprises, human?" Elias did not respond. He scanned the room, spotting the prisoner, an Earth Federation agent, bound and restrained in an energy field. The man was conscious but battered, his uniform scorched and torn. Zalrath followed his gaze and let out a slow, rasping chuckle. "Ah, I wondered if you would care." Elias leveled his weapon. "Release him." The Emperor tilted his head, stepping forward. "You have already killed so many of my warriors. Do you truly think one more death concerns me?" "It should," Elias said. "Because it's going to be yours." Zalrath exhaled through his sharp teeth. "You are not what you claim to be?" Elias ran. "You're right," Elias admitted. "I'm worse." The Emperor lunged, faster than something his size should have been capable of. Elias barely had time to sidestep before the Zrithian's claws raked across the space he had occupied. He countered with a sharp strike to the ribs, but Zalrath was armored, and the blow barely registered. The Emperor swung again, but Elias had already dropped low, rolling beneath the attack and bringing his plasma blade up in a sharp arc. The weapon connected, slicing through part of Zalrath's arm plating, drawing a hiss of pain. The Zrithian retaliated with a brutal backhand, sending Elias crashing against the war table. Stars burst behind his eyes, but he pushed past the pain, rolling away just as Zalrath's claws tore through the console where his head had been. Elias moved on instinct, analyzing, adapting. He feigned a stagger, drawing the Emperor in. Zalrath lunged, and Elias struck. A quick sidestep, a precise thrust, and his blade found the joint in the Emperor's armor, piercing deep. Zalrath roared, stumbling back, ichor dripping from the wound. But he was not finished. He reached for the war table, slamming a fist into its control panel. A silent alarm. Reinforcements would be coming. Elias turned to the prisoner, slicing through the energy restraints in one motion. The agent collapsed, coughing. "Can you walk?" "Not fast," the man rasped. "But I'll keep up." Elias turned back to the wounded Emperor. Their eyes met. No words were needed. He fired a final shot, severing the room's power conduits. The chamber plunged into darkness. And then, like a shadow in the night, Elias vanished, leaving the Emperor wounded, enraged, and, for the first time in his life, afraid. The war chamber trembled as distant explosions rippled through the palace's foundations. Elias Wren moved swiftly, the weight of the injured operatives slowing them both, but not enough to be a liability. Reinforcements would be closing in fast. Every second counted. The corridors outside were bathed in flickering emergency lights, casting elongated shadows along the walls. The electromagnetic pulse from earlier had disabled some of the automated defenses, but the palace's internal security network was adapting. Elias could hear the distant stomp of armored boots, the telltale sound of approaching Zrithian enforcers. He took a breath, recalibrating his strategy. The war chamber was no longer the center of the conflict. It was the beginning of something much larger. The operative grunted as he stumbled, catching himself against the wall. His face was slick with sweat, his breathing uneven. "I appreciate the rescue," he rasped, "but you should have left me." Elias gave him a quick glance. "I don't leave people behind." The man let out a rough chuckle. "Then you're in the wrong line of work." Maybe he was. It didn't matter now. The corridor opened into a docking bay, a vast expanse of steel platforms and hanging support beams. Zrithian fighter crafts were stationed in neat rows, each one prepped for war. They had planned for this conflict long before Elias had ever set foot in the palace. That confirmed it. The negotiations had never been genuine. This wasn't an assassination attempt. It was a declaration of war. Elias spotted what he needed, a command console situated on the upper observation deck. If he could access the mainframe, he could transmit data back to the Federation, evidence of the Zrithians' treachery, fleet movements, war preparations. Earth needed to know. The operative followed his gaze. You planning something suicidal? Something efficient. Elias handed him a sidearm. Stay here. If anyone other than me comes down that ramp, shoot first. The man gave a grim nod, bracing himself against a cargo container for cover. Elias moved, silent and precise. He scaled a maintenance ladder, slipping into the shadows of the overhead walkway. Below, Zrithian troops patrolled in staggered rotations, their weapons scanning the empty spaces, searching for him. Their discipline was impressive, but Elias had long since learned that even the most disciplined could be broken when their expectations were shattered. He reached the console, fingers flying over the alien interface. The language was complex, but he had studied it before arriving. He bypassed the encryption, diving into the palace's network, scanning for high-priority data packets. It didn't take long. Tactical fleet formations, supply routes, deployment schedules, everything the Federation would need to launch a counteroffensive. A notification blinked on the console. Outbound signal detected. Elias frowned. Someone else was sending a transmission. He accessed the transmission logs. The message was already in its final stages, addressed to the Zrithian War Council, relaying information about the palace attack. Then a signature he recognized, Zalrath. The Emperor wasn't just securing his own escape. He was broadcasting a message to every Zrithian fleet in the sector. Elias activated the decryption tool, scanning the message's contents. His stomach tightened. The time for patience is over. Earth has shown its intentions. The human emissary was an assassin. The Federation has declared war. We respond in kind. Mobilize the war fleet. Burn their colonies. A slow exhale left Elias' lips. It was a lie, of course, but it didn't matter. The moment that message reached the war fleets, the Zrithians would retaliate with full force. Elias initiated a countermeasure, corrupting the message's metadata, delaying its transmission. It wouldn't hold forever, but it might buy Earth enough time to prepare. A sudden shift in the air behind him. Instinct. Elias twisted just as a plasma blade carved through the space he had occupied. He threw himself backward, rolling to his feet in a defensive stance. The assassin was Zrithian, clad in a sleek, matte black exosuit, twin blades extending from cybernetic forearms. His movements were fluid, precise, a professional. Elias recognized the stance, the silent grace, the controlled breathing. This wasn't a palace guard. This was one of Zalrath's personal enforcers. The assassin lunged, the first blade coming high, the second low, a feint designed to force an opponent off balance. Elias countered, sidestepping, redirecting the strike with a quick parry. The Zrithian was fast, but Elias was faster. He shifted his weight, stepping inside the assassin's guard and striking hard, his fist connecting with the creature's jaw. The Zrithian staggered, but only for a second. Then a flick of the wrist, and a concealed blade shot from its gauntlet. Elias barely dodged in time, the blade slicing through the fabric of his sleeve. He didn't waste time. With a fluid motion, he grabbed the assassin's wrist, twisted, and drove his knee into the alien's abdomen. The armor absorbed part of the impact, but the force was enough to send the assassin reeling. Elias seized the moment. A sharp, deliberate strike to the throat. The assassin choked, body seizing. Another strike, and the Zrithian collapsed. Elias exhaled, stepping back, his body humming with adrenaline. He returned to the console, fingers dancing over the controls. He rerouted the palace's defense systems, shutting down containment measures, disabling comms relays. The palace was no longer Zalrath's stronghold. The operative's voice crackled in his earpiece. Not to rush you, but we have a problem. Elias scanned the docking bay below. More troops were arriving. Dozens. No, hundreds. And beyond the docking bay's force field, in the sky above the palace, the true horror began to unfold. Zrithian warships. Hundreds of them. The fleet had already begun to mobilize. Elias felt the weight of it settle in his chest. It was too late to stop the war. Zalrath had played his hand well. A thunderous explosion rocked the palace. Elias barely kept his balance as fire bloomed across the far walls, tearing through the structure like wildfire. He activated his communicator. Status. The operative's voice was tight with urgency. Your distraction worked. I stole a ship. You coming, or what? Elias turned back to the console, initiating one final override. A self-destruct sequence. If Zalrath wanted war, Elias would make sure the Emperor didn't live long enough to see it. He moved fast, retracing his path back to the docking bay. Plasma fire erupted around him as he sprinted toward the stolen Zrithian vessel. The operative was in the cockpit, powering up the engines. What the hell did you do? Elias vaulted into the ship, sealing the hatch behind him. I gave them something to remember me by. The engines roared, and the ship surged forward, racing toward the atmospheric breach. Behind them, the palace burned. Above them, warships descended, casting long shadows over the Zrithian capital. The war had begun, and Elias was already thinking about how to end it. The stolen Zrithian fighter tore through the sky, plasma trails burning against the backdrop of an unfolding war. Elias Wren gripped the co-pilot seat, his gaze locked onto the growing battlefield ahead. The Zrithian war fleet had begun its full mobilization. Massive dreadnoughts rising from planetary hangars, sleek destroyers maneuvering into strategic formations, and swarms of smaller attack craft darting between them like metallic wasps. Inside the cockpit, the rescued Federation operative fought to stabilize their stolen craft. This is bad, he muttered, sweat glistening on his brow as his fingers danced over alien controls. Bad would have been dying back there, Elias said, strapping himself in. This is just another problem that needs solving. The ship rattled violently as the Zrithian planetary defenses locked onto them. A plasma bolt sizzled past, grazing their left wing. The operative cursed under his breath. You know how to fly one of these things? Elias reached over, flipping a sequence of switches with practiced ease. Enough to know we need to climb, break orbit, and signal the fleet before we get atomized. The operative sent him a sidelong glance. You make that sound simple. It usually is. A sudden explosion rocked the hull, alarms blaring as another near miss rattled their shields. Elias looked through the viewport. 3 enemy interceptors had broken off from the main fleet, moving in for the kill. He unbuckled his harness, moving toward the rear weapons bay. Keep us flying. I'll handle the rest. The operative didn't argue. Elias liked that about him. The rear bay doors hissed open, revealing a mounted plasma turret linked to the ship's targeting systems. Elias slid into position, gripping the controls with familiar precision. The first interceptor banked hard to the left, firing a volley of rapid plasma bursts. Elias tracked its movement, adjusting for velocity, then pulled the trigger. A burst of molten energy streaked through space, colliding with the enemy craft's wing. The interceptor spiraled out of control before erupting into a fiery explosion. The second and third ships pressed the attack, maneuvering with calculated aggression. Elias gritted his teeth, adjusting his aim as their stolen ship twisted through evasive maneuvers. He let out a slow breath, waiting, watching, until the exact moment presented itself. Then he fired. The second ship was fast, but not fast enough. The plasma round struck its cockpit dead center, vaporizing the pilot in an instant. The third ship hesitated, a fraction of a second's worth of doubt. Elias took the shot. Silence filled the weapons bay as the final enemy ship disintegrated into glowing debris. He exhaled slowly, letting the moments settle before pushing himself back to his feet. "How are we looking up there?" he called out. The operative's voice crackled through the comms. Like we might actually live. Elias re-entered the cockpit, taking in the battlefield ahead. The Zrithian fleet had begun its assault, launching waves of plasma artillery toward the human task force, just emerging from hyperspace. The Federation had responded faster than expected, warships breaking formation, unleashing barrages of retaliatory fire. The battle was in full swing. Elias knew what had to be done. He took over the flight controls, pushing the ship into a sharp ascent toward the outer atmosphere. We need to get this data to command before it's too late. The operative nodded, strapping in as Elias angled the ship toward deep space. The console flickered as he initiated a long-range transmission. This is Ren, priority code Omega-47. The Zrithians have declared war. I'm transmitting fleet positions, tactical assessments, and encrypted command directives. Earth needs to mobilize. Now. The message pulsed through the ship systems, bouncing off relay satellites, piercing through the interference of battle. A confirmation blinked on the screen. The signal had reached its destination. Message sent, the operative said, relief evident in his voice. Elias barely had time to acknowledge it before a new alert blared across the dashboard. Inbound missile. Too close. No time to evade. Impact. The shockwave tore through the ship's hull, sending them into a violent spin. Alarm screamed, oxygen levels fluctuated, and artificial gravity failed in an instant. The operative's chair snapped loose, and he was thrown against the bulkhead with a sickening crack. Elias fought against the spinning chaos, gripping the control panel with white-knuckled force. His vision blurred, blood dripping from a fresh gash along his temple. The ship was dying. Outside, the stars spun in a chaotic whirl, flashes of battle illuminating the void in bursts of green and orange. Elias tried to override the system failures, but it was useless. They were going down. He turned his head, spotting the operative slumped against the bulkhead, barely conscious. His breathing was shallow. Elias unstrapped himself, forcing his body through the weightless wreckage. He grabbed the man's collar, pulling him toward the emergency pod. "Not your day to die," he muttered, activating the pod's manual override. The operative's eyes fluttered open, barely registering what was happening. "What?" "You're going back to command," Elias said. "Tell them everything." The operative struggled weakly. What about you?" Elias sealed the pod, pressing the launch sequence. "I've got unfinished business." The pod's thrusters ignited, propelling it toward the distant Federation fleet. Elias turned back to the wreckage of the ship. The flames creeping through the damaged bulkhead cast flickering shadows across the cockpit. Through the viewport, a Zrithian war cruiser loomed, its massive form blotting out the distant stars. He had one last move to make. The ship's engines were beyond repair, but the targeting system still responded. He tapped into the weapon diagnostics, rerouting all remaining power into a final, singular burst. If he was going down, he was going to make it count. The war cruiser began charging its main cannon, the barrel glowing with condensed energy. Elias smirked, blood staining his teeth. "Checkmate," he fired. The overloaded plasma core erupted in a white-hot explosion, the force of it tearing through the war cruiser's underbelly. The impact triggered a chain reaction, one system failing after another, until the ship's core imploded in on itself. Elias felt a brief moment of weightlessness, the silent aftermath of destruction. Then darkness. He didn't know how much time passed. A voice, distant and distorted, filtered through his fractured consciousness. "Got him barely alive, bring him in." A different voice, sharper. "Is it him?" "Yeah, it's him." Elias tried to open his eyes, but the effort was monumental. His body felt heavy, disconnected. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, he felt himself being lifted, carried. He wasn't dead. Not yet. And as the war raged on, one thought lingered in his mind. This wasn't over.